Here in Washington, D.C., spring is in the air, and that means pollen is in the air. The wind spreads this golden powder everywhere, where it settles on all sorts of surfaces. We also inhale it, and that's when the hay fever starts. Up to 30% of Americans experience hay fever or allergic rhinitis. You may have heard people say their allergies are getting worse every year, which got us wondering, is that true? Is pollen becoming increasingly problematic? And what can you do to avoid it? To answer that, we visited an expert whose job it is to count the grains in the air. And we found out how seasonal allergies work. Let's start there. With hay fever, your immune system goes into overdrive. Pollen proteins bind to antibodies on immune cells, causing the release of a cocktail of chemicals that include histamines. Histamines trigger the inflammatory response that results in the classic allergy symptoms such as runny nose and sneezing, and in rare situations, anaphylaxis. Most people muddle through seasonal allergies with over-the-counter drugs like Allegra or Kerxton, which are antihistamines. These compounds bind to the same receptors as histamines in our bodies, blocking histamine from triggering your immune response. There are also corticosteroid sprays such as Flonase and Nasonex, which reduce inflammation. Allergy shots, which deliver small doses of the allergen to build up your immunity, can also help, although they take a while to kick in. Your best bet is to avoid the microscopic grains altogether, and that's nearly impossible. Remember, this stuff is everywhere and follows us around, clinging to our feet and clothing. You can try, however, to limit your time outdoors when pollen levels are high by checking daily reports online. And for that, you can thank your local pollen counters. Stationed at 51 locations in the US, these experts measure pollen levels at least 3 times a week, reporting them to local newspapers, TV stations, the National Weather Service, and the National Allergy Bureau. We got in touch with pollen counters at 2 stations outside Washington, D.C. in nearby Maryland. One is in Fort Detrick, run by Susan E. Kosisky and Mariko S. Marks. And the other one is in Owings Mill, run by David Kerxton. Certified by the National Allergy Bureau, these pros have been counting pollen for more than 2 decades. It's no easy task, as I learned firsthand when I visited David, a respiratory therapist. I went to see the process in action and to find out just how bad this allergy season is. Spoiler alert, it's not great.
This is actually the highest count for this year, and it will get higher.
Counting pollen starts with getting a representative sample from the air. To do that, David grabs 2 retractable plastic rods coated with sticky silicone grease to snag pollen. Then it's off to the roof, where a lonely little box called a rotorod awaits. David screws the retractable sample rods into the bottom of the box, where they will extend and spin at 2,400 RPM for 60 seconds every 10 minutes. After 24 hours, he takes the rods back to the lab where he dunks them in a solution called caberylostane. It's a mixture of basic fuchsin, glycerol, and ethanol that paints pollen grains red, making them easier to see on the microscope slide. Now here's the hard part. There are hundreds of pollen grains on the rods, mostly from dozens of different species of trees and weeds. Grass pollens and mold spores are counted too, but there aren't as many of them. David says it used to take him hours to count the grains, keeping track of each grain counted while constantly consulting with what he calls the pollen Bible. He says it took about 3 years to get the hang of it. Now, it only takes him about an hour, which is pretty incredible, at least to a newbie. But they all look the same.
That's right, but they are different.
Okay, but they look different to you?
They look totally different. Every pollen grain has a different look.
Oak's pollen, which is one of the DC area's worst allergenic offenders, looks sort of triangular, with little white dots at each point. Orchard grass releases pollen that looks like tiny little red melons. Ragweed, those spiky mushrooms in the middle, is one of David's favorite grains and is responsible for about 75% of weed allergies. Around here, we won't have to worry about them until the fall. So are pollen levels particularly high this year? I put the question to the pollen experts.
I think what happened this year is February and March were well below average for our pollen levels. Second week in March, we had this high peak. It's been sort of a roller coaster. Then again, I always say as the weather goes, so the pollen blows.
Basically, she says, weather conditions like rain or cold temperatures suppress the tree's pollens. So when it warms up, they release their grains all at once, leading to a spike in pollen levels in DC. Although pollen levels are high right now, David says it's too early to tell if pollen will be unusually high for the year. He adds that every year his patients say that it's a particularly bad year. But Susan says that generally pollen levels are rising every year, likely due to increased levels of CO2 in the atmosphere, which is coaxing plants to pump out more of the allergy-inducing pollen. So there may be some truth to the complaints. I personally have never experienced allergies, but I'd be happy to hear about yours. Which pollinating plants set off your allergies? Let us know in the comments, and thanks for watching.